Okay. I was waiting for this moment when my window shows up over here. Let's go full screen. Okay. Again, hi everyone. I'm Liam. I'm really excited to be back at Droidcon, sharing a few ideas with you all about design and getting some of your thoughts. If you don't know me, I'm Liam, a designer and design advocate on material design. So that means that I contribute to the material design system at Google, but I also work with other designers outside Google to improve design across their ecosystems. I think it's important to note that I'm here today as myself, talking about my ideas for the future of design. So I'm not necessarily getting into Google's products or plans. This talk is a synthesis of a lot of ideas and a lot of topics that I've been thinking about and working on over several years. But I'm still developing these things, so I'm excited to kind of share an introduction to get us thinking about possible futures for the discipline of design and creating digital interfaces. I hope you'll follow along and give your feedback as well. So with that out of the way, I'm going to start with a few pictures. And I want to know how many times you've seen one of these images that describes the experience of designing UX. The image that has probably been the most pervasive between ironic and earnest at different moments is that of two bottles of ketchup. So on the left, we have a glass bottle that has a metal screw top lid and stands upright. It's the kind of bottle that you have to hit with your hand or stick a knife into to get things going. But the image implies that at least it's aesthetically nice. It stands for the type of design that looks nice, regardless of the impact on our experience. There's an implicit value statement here that the bottle, which is labeled UI, is mostly concerned with visuals and sacrifices everything else. On the right, though, we have a plastic bottle with the lid facing down. This one squirts the ketchup out, and gravity helps the ketchup stay near the opening. The lid is even bigger for better balance. It is ostensibly, given its label as UX, a bottle whose primary concern is ease of use, a good experience, and more ketchup. The image, of course, can't illustrate for you that this bottle you still need to shake beforehand. It will probably fall over at some points, and it gets crusty around the opening. There's also this image of a desire path showing a well-trod dirt path next to a perfectly manicured sidewalk. The sidewalk is instructively labeled as design, again aesthetic, full of visual function and meaning, and it clearly represents a design intent, while the desire path is labeled user experience. This image too is loaded with implicit beliefs. The desire path would tell us that perhaps a designer should have made a diagonal sidewalk instead of a perpendicular one, or perhaps that user experience really means that the user will do whatever they want to accomplish a task, no matter how carefully we've placed our bricks. Finally, and I'm sure this isn't the last one that comes to mind, there's this gif of the guy with a glass of water who can't seem to take a drink. A straightforward task like drinking water is made to look impossible, even though for us, as viewers, the answer is right there. If you're viewing this as designers or developers, we see that someone has designed and created a glass that holds the water, and it's made for putting it to your mouth, and we give a knowing chuckle to the representation of a user who just can't figure it out. These images feel really relatable to us at different stages of the design process, and they can provide some much-needed comic relief when you're building a product. But they also share another common factor. They frame the intent and the context of the user as an aberration, something that should be worked around, predicted, influenced, standardized, or in the worst case, ignored. If these images are any kind of touchstones for our understanding of our discipline, we can probably use them for some critical self-reflection. Our work creating interfaces doesn't typically deal with things like ketchup bottles, sidewalks, or glasses of water. The technology we use to implement an interface is digital. And if we want to understand the possibilities the digital interface actually unlocks for us, it's worth backing up and examining how we got here, taking a much broader view of the discipline before coming back down to our practical day-to-day application. So we're going to get really, really abstract, and I hope you can stay with me and come back down into what we're doing every day. And since we're talking about digital interface, I want to start with the digital part. The digital, as it's described in 2021's Digital Anthropology, is that which can be reduced to binary code. This definition, as pointed out by authors Miller and Horst, shows that in a broad view, the digital can be viewed as an abstraction of the analog or physical world. The binary code can conceivably be configured into anything we can imagine. though we most often encounter it as a series of highly specific instantiations like apps. Miller and Horst point out how this abstraction is not without precedent. It can be compared to a similar abstraction that emerged with the invention of currency, which made the world reducible to baseline 10. At this earlier point of abstraction, quote, exchange became more distant and focused on equivalence rather than human and social consequence. As currency enforced a boundary between people and products, it underscored a separation between production and consumption, or bringing it back to our work, between creators and users. A separation that's really easy to see in the processes of design and coding. On the other half of this phrase, digital interface, is interface. Interface, I think, is a dance taking place on the point of encounter between two planes, the plane of the material and human, between object and subject, between the one who has created the interface and the one who encounters, the user. Design, the practice of designating the shape of one plane from within the other, long before the invention of the digital, has understood this principle. By creating objects that inherently reflect our own subjectivity as humans, design reinforces this boundary by crossing it over and over again. Take Marcel Breuer, a modernist architect with a prolific portfolio of furniture and chairs produced during his time at the Bauhaus. Chairs we understand to be objects. We as humans can bring to them our subjectivity, our bodies, our physical needs. Are we tired? Are we in a crowd? Are we indoors or out? We meet a chair with this subjectivity, and it, as an unchanging object, imparts its objective nature back onto us by doing things like supporting our back, looking nice on a patio, or folding away for easy storage. And this is interface. Breuer understood the peculiarity of this dance between subject and object, for us, user and digital product, acknowledging the notion of interface while anticipating the possibilities that the digital would unlock by illustrating in this old 1924 poster that, to paraphrase, chair design gets better and better every year. In the end, one sits on an elastic air column. That our idea of what constitutes a chair would become so elastic that it no longer physically exists was a funny notion when Breuer expressed it. But digital production promises the development of products that really are abstracted to this degree. Chairs that are as adaptable and easily replicated as thin air, accommodating our infinite subjectivity with an unopinionated and fluid range of objectivity. It's not hard to imagine how this kind of fluidity could deliver a reshaped relationship to products, if not also production. It could address and perhaps even correct the distance between human and machine that's imparted by the abstraction of the world into binary. And as consumers of material culture like chairs, we understand that most of these fabricated objects are the result of a process of production, some process of combining and refining simpler materials to create something new. Even the word product implies something produced or something brought forth as a final creation. In other words, it lies at the end of a process of refinement as a fixed object. In many cases, the objects around us are also understood to be the result of mass production, the process whose origin lies near the beginning of many chronologies of design, which I think is a topic worth returning to in a different talk. Mass production functions best in continuous motion, using tools and processes that are optimized for exact purposes. It owes its speed and efficiency to the standardization of the objects that it produces. These qualities tie design and its rationales directly to monetary costs, not only placing an emphasis on the process of design, but also in reinforcing the idea that design should be correct and that a form recognizable as the final one should be attained at any cost. In order to update the material process of, for example, to choose a random object, a ketchup bottle, the production line needs new molds for glass or plastic, it needs new machine parts that can precisely reproduce the bottle, and these are all things that are dictated by updated designs. The cost of these updates not only encourages opinionated and fixed designs, but it also means that design's response to consumption, the conversation between designer and consumer, is much slower than it could be. Adaptation in manufacturing as a response to material costs, consumer preference, aesthetic trends, or updated manufacturing processes takes a lot of time, and one production line is unlikely to produce a great number of variations in succession. The advent of digital products that are made from binary code and electricity rather than more complex material like glass or plastic quickens that pace of that conversation between designer and consumer significantly, as the processes that create these products can do so without direct concern for the cost of materials or time for retooling. The material cost of a button in an app doesn't change based on the design of the button necessarily. The only further input the system requires is labor from the designer and software engineers. Moreover, digital products, no matter the intent of the designer, don't behave like machine parts. Mirka Madinau and Daniel Miller in the 2012 volume Migration and New Media illustrate how the process of polymediation makes digital products more like an assemblage of generalized tools, taking on different subjective meanings through different use in different personal and cultural contexts, rather than repetitively performing an isolated specific task like a tool on a machine line. It's unlikely for an individual component in a mass production line to take on the same kind of social and cultural significance or designation as its digital counterpart. For example, consider the social significance of a belt that carries a generic cylindrical glass bottle compared to a green iMessage bubble. If we acknowledge these discrepancies between analog and digital modes of production, it becomes clear that the conversation between designer and consumer can become faster, more dimensional, and more inclusive than before, unbound by the historical weight and conception of design as a discipline. Digital production has an unprecedented ability to iterate on concepts, processes, and products, fine-tuning them to match the goals of creator and user, within broader systems that acknowledge the fluid nature of their use. Despite this capacity, most contemporary design practices rely intuitively on reflections of this analog practice. The conversation hasn't actually quickened. The assembly line has. And, as I have since I first heard it 8 years ago, I keep coming back to this quote from Keller Easterling when she discussed her book Extra Statecraft at SPAN in 2015. She said, "You don't square up to every weed in the field with a righteous fight. You have to change something in the soil." As the people responsible for creating digital products, our collective gaze is fixed on systems, standardization, and the illusion of best practices to solve problems. Mass production's promise of profitability and efficiency through standardization has taught us a distracting lesson that incentivizes systems that are only interested in consumption. Often this leads to solutions that satisfy not the user's intention, but our own. And our responses to the externalities that I've talked about can only happen in aggregate because we're only shipping one thing at a time. The ways that we choose to talk about our discipline that are involved in digital production also point to a mental model that sees production and consumption as the primary modes of experience for which we should optimize, rather than some other facet of the human experience. User experience and user interface, for example, are terms predicated on experience through use of a thing that's already created, while interaction and product design straightforwardly describe the intent to optimize the reproduction of results. The organization of the disciplines involved in digital production exposes not only perhaps a misunderstanding of what's possible, but also some assumptions that we have about our own positionality within broader and more complex social, political, and economic systems that do more to shape and mediate the experience of digital products than we do. By coming too close to the comforting wisdom of mass production and the incentives of capitalism, these systems of design ensure that no one thing is very likely to be designed for any one person. Despite the competing and, I think, very compelling promise of digital production that, in fact, everything could be designed for every person. On the other side of this process stand users. User is a term that's common enough to discussions of digital interface, but I feel it also needs to be disambiguated, even as questions remain about what it means to describe a person as a user, whether the term is a useful heuristic for us or needs to be thrown out for something more humane and descriptive. In this session, I'm going to use the term user to stand for the colloquial understanding that a user is someone who experiences products through use, and, importantly for this work, not through production. But I'll argue that no matter what term we use, our notions about the role of a user must evolve to encompass more modes of experience and integration into more nuanced subjective contexts. In this role of user, one is expected to find and fit into behaviors of action, developing new intentions as a means of satisfying existing ones by learning to use a digital interface. This learning process, which is a consequence of the user's exclusion from the process of production, is not a task that can be underestimated. In a local sense, it involves a ton of small-scale tasks like learning and keeping up with abstract patterns we've invented, like gesture control, navigation, but also understanding the qualities and functions of a device on which the interface is presented. Returning back to this idea of polymediation, being a user also requires decisions about which product you're going to use for a given task, while also maintaining an understanding of how all the products in your phone or whatever device are related, how they're used and understood by yourself and by others, and that's a process that's informed by your cultural and personal context. It's a relationship to digital products that interacts deeply with one's identity and perception, and that makes it an ongoing role rather than just a discrete task. We also have to understand that digital production extends beyond the practice of coding into the practice of deciding what should be coded. Along with implementation, design has always completed processes of production as an expression of intent. In digital production, coding and design both remain abstracted themselves. The code-based implementation of digital products is mediated by other digital products that are built for coding. Design, likewise, is mediated by digital products made for design. We should remain aware of how these tools, which cast creators as users, placing us in a recursive relationship with our own work, shape what is ultimately produced. Having set up the background, let's explore what it would really mean to diverge from analog modes of production in our own work, to fully take advantage of the promise of digital production. To begin to get an idea what that means, consider what it might be like if the people we now call users were instead creators. If the people who we now expect to passively experience and consume a product actually could derive their own experiences by expressing their intention, how radically different could our work as product creators of all types be? Architecture, the outcomes of which are interface, already recognizes some of the potential here, edging physical products toward a malleable, dynamic mode of experience through movable elements like shoji panels, curtain walls, and other components that allow people occupying physical space to easily reconfigure it in a way that a chair or even an app usually can't. We know as creators of digital products that we have an exponentially larger capacity for expressing this type of potential in our own work. An interface in actual space could be the physical contact between your body and a chair, while ours is often finger, voice, eye, and ear to device. Consider that a chair rarely learns anything from how a person sits, or where they want to put their feet, or even what they can do with their hands. One successful implementation of adaptable design based on user intention is the accelerating development of variable type technologies, fonts that are packaged not as individual styles as foundries did for hundreds of years, but rather one program that contains a continuum of possible expressions of a typeface. The product of the design process for variable type does not presume to know or even understand the intent of the people who will be working with it later. These are graphic designers and typographers, who are constrained only by which variables or axes are made available within the typeface. When I studied at the Type at Cooper program in New York, I learned from type designer Hannes Famira that a font, the instance of a typeface we were designing, was just one point in a multidimensional field called the design space. The variables of variable type, called axes, run through this conceptual 3D space. Anywhere there's an axis, we can see a continual line of expression through the design space. Some axes, like font weight, run straightforwardly from one point to another, for example, from thin to extra bold. Others intersect one another, drawing themselves into 2 dimensions. Still others have gravity on one another. As one axis goes up, another might necessarily go up, but at a different pace. I see digital interfaces existing within their own kind of design space, where axes like touch and visual acuity, focus, time, and others could all influence the instance of the interface a person is presented with. Today, we're still mostly designing for one-dimensional points in this design space, rather than lines, planes, and polyhedrons. But we actually do have a few ways of instantiating somewhat complex axes in our work already. A simple example is adaptation across screens. In material design, we've created guidance for adapting between screens from large to small. The screens or breakpoints that we might document could be understood to represent individual values within one axis, screen size, running through the design space of an interface. But if we pause for a moment, we can imagine moments where other axes might be running parallel nearby, might intersect with screen size in interesting ways, and these are things that we have to account for. For example, on a very large or small screen, we can make certain assumptions about not only the device to which it belongs, but how it's being used. A screen that's TV size, for instance, might actually be a TV, and this is information we can access when we're creating an interface. What then might be the other axes overlapping with this screen size? Design guidance for TVs draws focus specifically to things like attentiveness. We can draw from research and our own experience a rough knowledge of how attentive a person is when they're watching TV, and what and create an interface that matches that attention with the right level of detail, size of components, and types of information. The way that we organize actions around that information could comprise another axis having to do with input modalities. On a TV, you're likely used to using a remote control, a gamepad, or other input device, rather than making direct contact with the screen like you would on a phone or tablet. These possible modalities represent stops along this other axis, and this axis will inform how the interface is ordered, how quick it is, for example, to traverse from one item to the next, or to reach a desired item from the top of the screen. Material U that was introduced with Android 12 opens up the system to an unknowable form of intent, in this case user-selected wallpapers, which it uses to inform fundamental qualities of the interface, in this case color schemes of interfaces and imagery. In this case, the axis of color expression is populated by the HCT color space, which is created specifically for accommodating unknown user intent with perceptually consistent responses. Rather than making distinct individual choices for every color of an app's interface, this new color system is instead built around the relationships between different elements in an interface. These relationships then absorb the intent of the designer for things like emphasis, importance, and function to apply colors, any colors, in a consistent, predictable way. The user's mental model takes shape without direct intervention from designers, and it's based on their own choices about their device. There's, of course, a lot more work to be done here to realize the fully adaptive future at a system level, and that's whether we're talking about a design system or an operating system, and I think we're talking about both. The natural direction of this line of thinking is to fully realize these axes and others, seeing an individual interface as one point in a multi-dimensional space containing all possible interfaces for a given app, allowing an interface to function again as one piece of technology that contains within it a fuller range of possible expressions that are directly guided by individual need and intention. Let's zoom back out just one more time for a moment to understand why this model of design, a model where users can directly influence their own interface, is important. Carrie Murphy is the co-founder of The Fabricant, a studio that produces virtual couture, that is, clothing that exists only in virtual space. When designing for virtual space, Murphy says that his studio uses the language of physical clothing design while materials become unbound by normal physical constraints. The raw materials, he says, are data. The texture, strength, color, weight, and dimensions of fabric are all expressed again as ones and zeros. In our discussion on design notes, Murphy also divulged his own experience creating and then interacting with a photorealistic virtual avatar of himself. Through trying on challenging new garments and programming his body to do heretofore impossible movements, Murphy uncovered something about the self-actualizing potential of digital experiences. This embodiment allowed him, as it allows others, to reflect on what it would be like if their actual world intentions could be easily satisfied in digital space. More than that, it drew into question the subject-object relationship that Breuer and others would have assumed before the advent of sophisticated digital interfaces that we have today. Suddenly, the will of the images that were being presented to Murphy as objects were actually aligned with his will as a subject, directly shaped by it, in fact. The conversation became two-sided, and both sides were in agreement. Tom Belsdorff echoes this dynamic in his ethnographic work on virtual worlds, including his 2015 book, Coming of Age in Second Life, noting that, quote, corporations who saw Second Life as interactive misrecognized interactivity for creation. The cultural logic was not that residents interacted with a commodity and its producer, but that they literally produced what they consumed through self-actualizing acts of creation. The implications for virtual worlds where residents can create their own body, clothing, house, and decorations using data as raw material are clear. The residents of these spaces exist entirely through their own acts of creation within that world. Their intention for their own presentation and integration into the social milieu of virtual space is directly manifested through the world itself. Zooming back in, we have to ask, what about the implications for our work, which largely manifests itself within the borders of screens in the actual world? We can begin to get a better understanding of digital interfaces' self-actualizing potential for users and what it may look like to give individuals the power to create their own experiences if we consider what lies at the root of most interface today: information and action. These, I've come to think, are building blocks of what we would now call user experience. From these primitives, we derive components like a button. Components afford interactions, and these come together into UI regions. These comprise screens, screens comprise flows, and flows comprise apps. And I'm sure that you've certainly seen it broken down like this before, from small abstracted concepts up to large practical applications. But I think information and action are the smallest particles we can observe directly. Another foundational constraint that we often acknowledge and account for in design is human factors, the realities of the human body and cognition that impact how we're able to interact with an object. These principles, which have been variously documented by standards bodies and design practitioners, myself included, in Droidcon's past, often appear at the bottom of a layer cake of considerations in discussion of interface design. But in a model that's organized from the principles of information and action, human factors are more like the shape of the cake itself. In the future presented here, individual intent would be a human factor that, just like touch, voice, vision, hearing, cognition, and others, we must be able to account for in the things we create, without precise knowledge of what it is or how it might change. In other words, if information and action are the primitives that grow into a full interface, how people choose and are able to interact with technology at that interface is a superseding layer, and I think that's where true adaptation really lives. In the more distant future, I believe that interfaces we encounter will be much closer to a pure flow of information and action, rather than being deliberately and carefully grown from primitives into entire distinct flows and apps. The interface will exist in a framework that allows it to spontaneously arise and configure itself into emergent patterns based on the intent and subjectivity of the person using it. The interface is, in this model, still certainly our site of encounter with technology, but the dynamic between object and subject will shift, and we will see our own intent directly shaping the interface with which we're presented. We will, in other words, finally have the equivalent of Breuer's elastic air column, but for every interaction we have with our devices. It's clear that changing the way we understand and practice our discipline will be complex. It will rely on new technology, experimental thinking, expanding resources, new tools, and a theory of design that reckons with our own position in the world as creators. In an interview for Design Notes, Senior UX Design Manager Rob Giampietro underscored the gravity of our work and the importance of recognizing it, saying, quote, "You're deciding when someone should turn the page, how heavy their phone is that they pick up every day, whether they need to swipe to get more information or if they can have it right there on the screen. All of those things are ways that you're actually changing someone's experience of their life through design, and I don't think there could be a more transformative discipline than that." And transformative is an apt word. When we design something, implement it, and put it into the world, we are causing a transformation. At the surface level, we're transforming someone's experience. That's big enough. But we're also transforming and potentially constraining the range of possible experiences by making choices about what products can do and how they can do them. And we're transforming ourselves. Our discipline often puts us, our perspectives, our experiences, our beliefs, into the world within the products we create, just by virtue of the fact that we're ultimately humans creating things for other humans. And I think that should ensure that the future of design is, in so many ways, still personal. Thank you all again for coming. Again, this is just an introduction, and I hope you'll follow along and let me know what you think. Have a great conference.